So I'm once again at Slimbridge Wetland Centre, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a guide, I suppose, into how I approach learning how to do better birds in flight photography, and that's a bit long-winded. First things first, I've been stuck in the car for far too long because there was a horrendous traffic jam, so I'm going to go and get a coffee and just weep. It's an hour and a half longer journey than I expected. Great.
Oh yeah, Dr. following you.
Well, so far today it has been significantly busier than I thought it would be, and therefore quite a bit more challenging to film here than I thought. I've got about 2 of the shots that I'd planned. So welcome to Slimbridge Wetland Centre. I come here a lot for photography, but the place I spend the most amount of time here is here on the boardwalk with my very friendly seagull and my friendly pigeons and things like that, because this is, in my opinion, the exact place you should be to practice your birds in flight photography. For a few reasons. Number one, there's a lot of birds here and they fly in here a lot, and the reason for that is that there's a lot of people here with food, because you're allowed to feed the birds in this area, so it's very common for the birds to fly into this bit. It's got a couple of different directions that the wind can come from as well, so you're in quite a good position to get them flying in different directions. I'm going to rattle through a few tips that I think are relevant to practicing your birds in flight photography, and the reason why I think you should practice birds in flight photography, if you want to, is that when you finally see something really interesting or a really exciting event, you will be better prepared to photograph it. And I think that practice is very, very good in this regard, particularly for the style of shooting that I'm going to talk about. And that does not involve a tripod, wherever it is. It's further away than I thought. I do not use a tripod for birds in flight photography, or indeed most photography, to be honest, because they suck and I just don't like using them. But this is just here for filming, and I will not be using it. Obviously, if you do need to use a tripod because your camera's too heavy, etc., that's fine. I'm not saying you can't use a tripod, just that I don't. So what I'm specifically looking for are birds flying towards me, and this is an ideal location for it, really, because the birds do fly towards me here. I mean, I've got my resident friendly seagull down here who's having a nap. There's often birds taking a nap around me while I'm stood here. They're very, very tame, and that's of huge benefit. So they actually will fly directly towards you. There's a couple of paths out of here, over that way. A lot of the ducks take off to go and feed, and so there's an additional spot over there that's really good to stand in to photograph birds flying towards you, but the background is less ideal because mostly what you're getting is the visitor centre, and the problem with that is that straight lines are not very natural and they're very obvious in the backgrounds of your photos. So where possible, try and get some trees in the background, like you do have from this spot. So even though this is more awkward and there's a lot more people around, you do have a better background opportunity, and I've got some very nice photos by waiting until the birds are in exactly the right spot in front of the nice background. I do not like tripods. That angle's not very good. Right, so the Peak Design tripod is very compact, but it is quite irritating. So yes, I'm shooting with the Atomos Ninja on the top, so I can record a bit of what I'm seeing through the viewfinder. But it does interfere with my hat. I couldn't actually shoot like this when I had the Sigma. It was just too heavy, because this is quite a weighty thing to stick on the top because I bought an excessively large battery for it. didn't really think that through. So today is an interesting day in terms of weather, in that it's extremely bright about 50% of the time. So I'm shooting both my filming camera and this on highlight priority metering mode. The downside of that is that it does seem to make it more difficult for the Z9 in particular to focus. The general gist with the autofocus settings is that they are quite twitchy. You want it to pick up new subjects quickly. You don't necessarily care about it tracking them, because what it will effectively do is just pick up the same subject repeatedly over and over as it moves more closely to the frame. One setting that I think is very useful for birds in flight, and particularly when there's a lot going on, is making sure you have some way of pulling focus back to a closer point, because cameras tend to focus better going from near to far. They have a lot more trouble coming back off of something they've already focused on, such as a tree in the background. And in that regard, I would highly recommend having either an easy way, like I do with my finger here, to roll focus back, or a button assigned to pull it back to a shorter focus distance. So in terms of camera settings, it obviously varies from camera to camera. This is quite a high resolution camera. This has a 45 megapixel sensor, and therefore for action photos like this, I'm shooting at 1/3200th of a second, and that's just the right speed for sort of medium-sized birds to get a little bit of blur on the wingtips of the bird, but get the head in focus, because the head doesn't move quite as much. On lower megapixel bodies, like a 20 to 25 megapixel body, 1/2500th of a second seems to work fine and gives the same effect. In terms of other camera settings, I shoot auto ISO, and I think you should too, especially on a bright day. There's no reason not to. And this just takes one additional thing out of the thought process of taking the photos. You want this to be as quick a setup as possible, or as brainless as possible to shoot in these situations, because you're looking at quite rapid action. Is that duck coming this way? No. So behaviour-wise, for birds, they're going to fly towards where there's food, but when they take off generally into the wind. That's actually not a good thing today, because the wind is coming from that direction. So if I wanted to get them taking off, I'd be going up there. When they come into land, usually they also land into the wind, but that doesn't really matter too much on this pond, because they want to land on this pond because this is where the food is. So they'll put up with it not being quite perfect. I sort of think of this as the lazy man's approach to birds in flight photography, and it's in fact not very lazy at all. You have to hold a fairly hefty camera up and maneuver it around a lot. But it's lazy in that you don't have to prepare or even think necessarily. I'm in a good place for birds, and I'm just waiting for stuff to happen. And the nice thing about doing it this way is that lots of things are happening. I'm not waiting for one specific type of bird. I don't really care what I see. I am just here to get photos of birds. It doesn't matter if it's of a specific type of bird, and that's why I have so many photos of pigeons. One aspect to this type of photography that I find is that I shoot at full extension of this lens. This is a 600mm lens, and I shoot like that most of the time. But I'm trying to pick up things moving from further away and moving towards me, and if they're getting really close, like within 4 or 5 meters, I'll start pulling the zoom back out and drop it to sort of about 300mm to get the bird in. But I specifically want tight crops. I want the bird big in the frame. I mean, I can crop in on this camera, but on a smaller camera, on a lower megapixel camera, you can't always do that. So I think it's a good thing to practice trying to fill the frame as much as possible. Sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you get the perfect frame where the bird takes up all of the frame but doesn't get cut off. But sometimes you get quite nice close crops of birds where maybe the wings aren't even in the shot, but you get a nice amount of detail on the head and neck. And I feel like those shots are still worth taking. Something else that I do, which I think is a technique worth using, but does give you a headache sometimes, is that I tend to shoot with both eyes open. You'll see this in video clips, and it makes me look a little bit weird. But when you're following action, or looking for action, it's very beneficial to be able to see peripheral motion outside of the camera. Obviously, you can't see the right-hand side because it's blocked by the camera, or, depends on which eye you use, I guess. But I do, in general, find that it works quite well. Now, probably the most useful skill that you can learn, if you don't already have it, when it comes to action photography, or especially when you're tracking small subjects, is the ability to raise your camera and to point it exactly at the thing. This just takes practice. I still miss a reasonable amount at the time, but just through doing it a lot and getting used to where exactly the camera lines up with my vision, I am getting quite a bit better at it. And especially when it comes to moving subjects, this is really challenging. But you can practice this using a static subject, just looking around and trying to make sure that when you raise the camera, you're pointing it exactly where you want it. This will help you with action shots. As I turn the recording camera off, I got some nice duck flight shots. Lovely. Nicely framed too. When it comes to birds like mallards, and indeed pigeons, highlight priority metering mode is very useful because they have very pale feathers and very dark feathers, and the camera, or at least this camera, very much struggles to meter correctly on them. Something I'd like to see from the manufacturers next. They've done AI autofocus. We've got AI denoising, albeit not on camera yet. What about AI metering? Subject-specific metering. That could be an interesting next step for cameras. It's very loud ducks behind me now. In general, the trickiest aspect I find for doing birds in flight in this way is to match the pace of the bird with your movements. And this just takes practice. I still don't get it right all the time. I'm not perfect at predicting every type of bird, but you will gradually get better the more that you do it. I find ducks generally quite straightforward because they're larger, and in fact, practicing with larger birds is a good way to get into it. I think pigeons can be somewhat unpredictable in that regard. They move very rapidly and they're amazing flyers, but ducks fly generally in quite straight lines, quite predictable lines. They just don't take off quite as often, which in that regard can be a little bit more problematic. To remove the Atomos because its battery is low and it's annoying me. I wish there was an easier way of recording than sticking that on the top. The sun's about to come back out again for a bit, and hopefully starting to get a few more birds coming in because we're getting towards the evening. It's 3:25 at the moment. It's one of the most useful changes that I've made to my Z9 setup, and this is relevant for all cameras, not just the Z9, is that I've put metering mode on a function button, and on this one it's on function 3, which is down at the bottom. And this just allows me very quickly to swap between matrix metering mode and highlight-based metering mode, which I'm using a lot. Swapping between those two works very well for me, because when the sunlight becomes extremely harsh like this, the only metering mode that tends to work correctly is highlight-based metering mode, or you're going to blow a lot of the highlights. And on birds, that's a bit of a problem because you lose all of the detail in the feathers. This camera underexposes very nicely, and you can bring the exposure back up later without introducing too much noise. It obviously does vary from camera to camera, but if your camera has a highlight-based metering mode, I'd recommend using it. It's in these sorts of situations, at least. It does work. Something I would use to describe the way I shoot is ergonomic, I suppose. Sounds a bit pretentious, but because I've had things like problems with my knees. I sometimes get problems with my back. I'm only in my 30s. I do find that I photograph in a comfortable way. That's not to say that holding a heavy camera is necessarily comfortable, but it does mean that I get to stand up rather than kneeling or lying on the floor. And birds in flight photography is, in my opinion, one of the more ergonomic forms of bird photography, because you don't have to lay in the mud and crawl across fields in order to do it. Who can be bothered with that? Instead, I find it's best done standing up and freely able to move around and rotate. I find that the easiest way of getting good birds in flight photographs. Keeping your feet free and able to move is ideal. That's a little bit of a problem here because I'm constantly surrounded by sleeping birds, but the principle is sound. There are many things that play into the comfort of photography for you, though. This may not work for you for whatever reason, and that's fine. There's many different ways of doing it. This is just what I find most comfortable, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why I got back into photography was because I find this a very useful exercise for this shoulder, which I broke. It's proven very good for building up the muscle in that area again. It does start to ache after a while, though, although that's also true if I just go shopping, so it might just be me, I guess. Okay, it's 5 to 4. I'm going to go and grab a drink, I think, and then we'll return for sunset. As far as benches go, this one is pretty good, so I'm going to have my drink on this bench. After how hectic it was earlier with so many people, it's remarkable how much it's quietened down. This seems to be fairly common here. People seem to come for the morning and then go home, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity if you've got the energy to stick around until later. If you're a member of the WWT, you can get in here at 8:15 in the morning, which does actually mean it can end up being a relatively long day for a lot of people. There's also quite a lot of walking to be done here if you go off in each direction. So I do understand it, but with the way the sunlight comes around and hits the building and that boardwalk area in the evening, I think it's worth sticking around. You're going to get some really, really nice backlit and side-lit photos. And they feed the geese and ducks and swans and a lot of pigeons, the birds basically, around 5 p.m. some days. I don't really know what days they do it on, but some of them. I have mistimed this slightly. They are already feeding the birds over there, so I'm going to wander over now. That's a shame. Although the sunlight has also gone in, so it's not the end of the world. Might be some fairly nice ones at the Tufton Gate. Just give the camera a slightly easier time of it. With the pitter-patter of tiny feet. She does duck under the camera though, so, very respectful. In general, children are very useful if you're a bird photographer. A, because it's nice to see them out and enjoying it themselves, but also because they tend to attract all the birds to them. Well, remarkably, this place is completely emptied out now. I say remarkably, it is 5:10. I think that's pretty much me done for the day. I'm going to stick around for another 10, 15 minutes or so, just in case anything interesting happens, because the light is so nice here. But thank you very much for watching. Please do leave any comments down below, especially if you have any alternative ways that you like to do birds in flight photography. Are you somehow completely insane and do it lying down? I'd be really curious to know. Thanks again. Until next time. The nicest thing about this is I can finally put this bloody tripod away.